There are moments in history when power doesn't shift with tanks or missiles, but with spreadsheets, payment systems, and quiet decisions made by central banks after midnight. Nothing explodes. Nothing crashes on screen. And yet, the balance of the world begins to tilt. That is exactly where we are right now. Because the most important battle between the United States and China is no longer about trade tariffs, semiconductors, or even military strength. It's about money itself. Who controls it? Who settles it? Who can freeze it? And who is forced to live under someone else's financial rules? This is the currency war that almost nobody sees clearly, but one that is slowly putting the dollar under pressure in ways Americans are not prepared for. And before you click away thinking this is another end of the dollar scare story, stop for a moment. This is not about the dollar collapsing tomorrow. This is about something far more dangerous and far more subtle. It's about the dollar losing just enough power, just enough trust, and just enough dominance that America's economic advantage starts shrinking quietly, year by year, without a single dramatic headline to warn people it's happening. The question is not whether the dollar disappears. The question is whether America can keep living as if it never could. For decades, the US dollar has been more than a currency. It has been the operating system of the global economy. Oil is priced in dollars. Debt is issued in dollars. Trade is settled in dollars. Reserves are held in dollars. When crises hit anywhere in the world, money flows into dollars. This has given the United States an extraordinary privilege: the ability to borrow cheaply, to run massive deficits, to absorb shocks that would cripple other nations, and to enforce sanctions with global reach. The dollar has been America's silent superpower. China understands this better than almost anyone. And that's why the real conflict between America and China is not about beating the dollar outright, but about escaping its grip. Here's the uncomfortable truth most Americans never hear explained clearly. When a country controls the dominant global currency, it doesn't just control money, it controls access, it controls settlement, it controls who can pay whom, how fast, and under what conditions. That power becomes especially visible when sanctions are imposed, assets are frozen, or banks are cut off from global systems. These tools are incredibly effective, but they also send a message to every other country in the world. Dependence on the dollar is a vulnerability. China received that message loud and clear. So instead of trying to overthrow the dollar in some dramatic fashion, China chose a smarter, slower, and more realistic strategy: reduce exposure, build alternatives, and make sure the Chinese economy can function even if access to the dollar system is restricted. This is not ideological. It's defensive. And it's happening right now. China has been quietly expanding trade settlement in local currencies. It has pushed partners to accept yuan for energy, commodities, and manufactured goods. It has built parallel payment infrastructure that does not rely entirely on US-controlled systems. It has encouraged foreign banks operating in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to become comfortable holding and using yuan. It has worked to internationalize its currency, not by replacing the dollar everywhere, but by making sure the dollar is no longer unavoidable. That distinction matters, because a currency war in the modern world is not about one currency winning and another losing. It's about margin. It's about what happens when the dollar is no longer the automatic default for every transaction. Even small shifts can have massive consequences. Now ask yourself this: if fewer global transactions require dollars, what happens to global demand for dollars over time? If fewer countries need to hold large dollar reserves as insurance, what happens to demand for US treasuries? If foreign buyers become more selective about financing US debt, what happens to interest rates? And if interest rates rise structurally, what happens to mortgages, credit cards, car loans, business investment, and government budgets? This is where the currency war stops being abstract and starts hitting American households. The United States currently carries enormous levels of debt. Servicing that debt has been manageable largely because global demand for dollars and treasuries has remained strong. But if that demand weakens even slightly, the cost of borrowing rises. Not overnight, not explosively. Gradually. And gradual increases are often more dangerous than sudden shocks because people adapt too late. China knows this, and China also knows something else. It does not need to destroy the dollar to weaken America's advantage. It only needs to make the world comfortable with alternatives. But here's where the story becomes more complex and more honest. China has real limitations. The yuan is not fully free-floating. Capital controls remain. Global investors worry about transparency, legal protections, and the ability to move money freely. These are real barriers. This is why the dollar remains dominant. The dollar is trusted not just because of American power, but because of American institutions, markets, and legal frameworks. So why does this still matter? Because currency wars are not won by perfection. They are won by optionality. China's goal is not to convince the world that the yuan is better than the dollar. Its goal is to make sure countries don't have to rely on the dollar exclusively. Optionality weakens monopoly power, and the dollar has functioned like a monopoly for decades. Once that monopoly starts to crack, the pricing power that comes with it weakens. This is already visible in subtle ways. More bilateral trade deals settled outside the dollar. More regional arrangements that bypass US-centric systems. More central banks diversifying reserves, not abandoning dollars, but adding other assets. Each of these moves seems small in isolation. Together, they form a trend, and trends are what reshape economic reality. Now, let's talk about the US side of this equation, because this is where the real risk lies. The dollar's strength ultimately depends on confidence. Confidence in US governance, in fiscal discipline, in political stability, and in the rule of law. If the world believes America will manage its finances responsibly, protect its institutions, and avoid self-inflicted crises, the dollar remains dominant. But if confidence erodes, even slowly, alternatives become more attractive. This is why internal U.S. policy matters more than most people realize. Repeated debt ceiling standoffs, explosive deficits without long-term plans, political paralysis during crises. These do not immediately destroy the dollar, but they chip away at the perception that America is a predictable steward of the global system. And in finance, perception is reality. Ask yourself this uncomfortable question. If you were a foreign government holding trillions in U.S. assets, would you want all your reserves tied to a country that regularly flirts with default, even rhetorically? Or would you quietly diversify just in case? That's not anti-American thinking. That's risk management. Now here's the part that should make viewers sit forward in their seats. Currency wars do not end with dramatic announcements. They end with changed behavior. One day the world simply wakes up and realizes things are different than they used to be. The dollar does not collapse. It just stops being indispensable. And when that happens, America's margin for error shrinks. Higher borrowing costs become normal. Fiscal mistakes become more expensive. Inflation becomes harder to contain. Financial shocks become more painful. And policy choices that once felt easy suddenly feel constrained. China understands this dynamic deeply. That is why it plays the long game. That is why it avoids sudden moves that would trigger backlash. That is why it builds quietly, patiently, methodically. So where does this leave the average American? It means the future of the dollar is not decided in Beijing alone. It is decided in Washington, in budget negotiations, in regulatory consistency, in how crises are managed, in whether institutions remain credible, in whether the U.S. treats its financial dominance as an entitlement or as something that must be earned every day. Here's the most important question viewers should be asking themselves right now. If the dollar's dominance is slowly weakening at the edges, are American policymakers acting as if that privilege is fragile or as if it's permanent? Because history shows us something brutal and consistent. No reserve currency lasts forever. Not because it collapses suddenly, but because the world evolves, power shifts, systems adapt, and those who assume permanence are always the last to react. This is not about fear. This is not about doom. This is about awareness. The currency war between America and China is not coming. It is already underway. It is being fought quietly through settlement systems, reserve decisions, trade agreements, and financial plumbing that most people never see. And the outcome will not be decided by who talks the toughest, but by who manages trust, stability, and discipline best over the next decade. The dollar is still strong. The dollar is still dominant. But strength that is not protected becomes fragile. And the real question, the one that should linger long after this video ends, is simple and uncomfortable. In a world that no longer needs to rely on one currency alone, will America still deserve to be the center of the system? That answer is still being written.